Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to the Retro Wrestling Room. Today I am very excited. As you know, we do these podcasts every Tuesday and Thursday on the channel. I've gotten to speak to people from all over the world now. We've been to Japan, we've been to Vietnam, we've been to Ireland, we've been to the US, we've been everywhere. But sometimes we have guests on the channel that get me very excited to chat to them. And this is definitely one of those interviews. We have one half of the High Flyers with Greg Gagne. We have one half of the Killer Bees with Brian B. Blair. We have Jumpin Jim Brunzell on the channel. How's it going today, Jim?
Very good, Vince. Thank you very much for, it's fun to do these and I reminisce pretty well and the mind is, slowly fading away in terms of what I can remember, but I still remember times, that I had on the road and different guys that I worked with in the ring and, some real hair-raising events that still stand out in my wrestling memory.
Going like way back to the start, what are some of your like first memories of wrestling?
Well, as most people know, I started in 1972. Vern Gagne had a great camp. He had Ric Flair, and he had the Iron Sheik Khosrow Vaziri, and he had Ken Patera, and he had a pro football player and a great football player from Minnesota by the name of Bob Bruggers, and he had Greg and myself. So I had tried to play pro football. I had a little brief tryout with the Washington Redskins, and I didn't get asked back. So I thought, well, I'll go back to school, and I had 30 credits left to get my degree in education.
Mm.
So, and then Greg called me and he said, "Hey," he says, "how would you like to, be a wrestler?" And I said, "Oh, geez," I said, "the only wrestling I've ever done was, in high school in intramural." And he says, "That's okay. My dad's going to start from the very beginning." So
Right.
lo and behold, Vern had a camp and it was he and Billy Robinson. And Benji, it was 6 days a week. It was 6 hours a day. And it lasted a long time. And we learned all the mechanisms and throws and, how to spread your body on a bump so you didn't get hurt. But we didn't know anything about the psychology of pro wrestling or its inner, working type matches, etc. So it was a great opportunity for me. And I wrestled 27 years. I had 5,000 matches, and time went by like that. I did have some rough times, like wrestling in New York when Brian and I were the Killer Bees. We wrestled 3.5 years straight at 27 days a month. We wrestled, and we were on the road all the time, and I had a business at that time, and my wife, raised our two kids. My daughter was like 3 or 4 years old, and my son was a year old, and I was gone all the time. And then, when I did come home, the first day I was exhausted. Second day we did something. The third day I rested up and packed up, and the fourth day I was back on the airport. So
It-
could have been worse, but
yeah.
it was trying. Like I say, I wrote a book called Madlands.
Hmm.
I don't know, I don't even have it here, but yes, I do. And this book outlines my wrestling career, and I give a lot of credit and praise to my wife, Mary. We're going to be celebrating our 50th anniversary next month. And we're
Oh,
going to go
amazing.
to, yeah,
Congratulations.
thank you. We're going to go to Alaska. And she really held the Brunzell family together,
Mm.
and it's hard bringing up the kids, when you come home, for 3 days a month and boom, boom, boom. And then, different places, like I was in Charlotte in 1979 and 1980. We wrestled every day there too. And it's just a hard life.
Of course. I think that's something that not maybe not a lot of people actually hear about. We hear about the good times on the road and things like that and all these stories. But of course, when you get to go back home, then you've kind of got to balance this normality of, your home life, but then because you're there for such short spaces of times as well, you've got to try and cram everything in. So
Yep.
even when you get home, that it's not resting, is it?
No. Matter of fact, you almost are looking forward to go on the road again. So when you do fly into a town, you can lay down for 3 hours before you go
Yeah.
to the matches, But it all worked out very well. And like I say in my book, I was a survivor, I mean,
Mm,
there's a lot of guys from my era, that had problems with the road. They were, chemically dependent and substance abuse and sex and all that. I mean, it's not very conducive lifestyle for perpetuating a a positive um couple's life and
mm.
family upbringing. It's hard.
You mentioned training under Vern. You also trained with the UK legend Billy Robinson as well.
Yes.
What was it like training with them? What were kind of the similarities and differences between their styles of training?
Well, Billy was, actually Billy did all the training. He
Right.
did all the stuff and he did all the submission holds and
Mm,
he was just incredible to be in the ring with him.
mm,
And then later on, in my early part of the career, I had a couple matches with Billy and he was like a 255-pound ballerina. I mean, his balance and his timing was so second to none, and he knew every aspect of the business, and uh, he was one of the top, I would say, top 3 or 4 wrestlers of my time,
mm,
and he could do anything in the ring, and the problem with Billy was, everybody knew that he was good and they were afraid of him because he did manage to hurt a couple people, and, he could hurt you like that, a drop of a doggone pin, but, I was very fortunate that I got along with them and, yeah, we had a good relationship and, I was very, pleased that he helped train me.
mm. You mentioned 1972 was the year where it all started.
Yep.
In the AWA, we got some clips here from some of those early years. What was
Sure.
the territory like when you first started working there? I think this would have been the time of Vern and Nick Bockwinkel would have probably been challenging for the main titles at that time.
Yes. Well, I always considered the WWE the best area to work for because it had tremendous talent. We only had about 14 guys. But
Mm,
see, Vern realized that, being in Minnesota, it was, subject to long, hard winters. And people went out during the winters to see wrestling matches, but then when it came to be spring and summer, they they didn't. Vern said, "Hey, all these people have been cooped up. We're not going to have them. We're not going to have any wrestling. So the spring and summer were not really that active for us. So we only work like 12 to 15 times a month during the spring and the summer, which was great because we had time off." And then, like I said, we had such great talent. I mean, you had Robinson Gagne, you had Mad Dog Vachon, you had Baron von Raschke, you had Buddy Wolf, you had Bobby Heenan, who I consider the
mm,
greatest all-around wrestling talent ever in my era. And Bobby Duncombe and Jack Lanza, and then you had so many guys, the Crusher, and then Andre had come in and, I mean, it was great because these guys took time, you know, in the ring when you were working with them, and it was such a learning experience that it set the stage, for you to progress pretty well. And, it was I was, you know, I really benefited from that opportunity.
pretty early on in the run, I think it was 74, you faced a very young at the time, Ric Flair.
Yes.
I think that would have been around 74, 75, something like that. What was it like facing Rick back then? Could you tell early on, that you would become this like special talent at that time?
Oh gosh, yes. He
Yeah.
was a natural. I mean,
Mm.
you know, when Rick was enrolled at the university, one quarter, I think he only went to class 2 or 3 times, and during that quarter, and he he embodied the persona of a pro wrestler. I mean, he could do an interview like that, and he knew exactly how he wanted to be. And some of his big idols were was Dusty Rhodes and guys. That and he was incredible in the ring. I remember I had the opportunity over the course of my career. I wrestled 3 1-hour draws with him,
Mm.
and a couple of them were, one was in Charlotte, North Carolina, and one was in Anderson, South Carolina. I'll never forget that. And they had no air conditioning in the building. It was like
Oh.
July, and it was about 105 degrees in there. And the people were sweating profusely like we were,
Mm.
and we did
Yeah.
an hour match, and at the end of the match, we were so lathered with sweat, we couldn't grab on to nothing. I mean, it just slid all over the place, and I'll never forget, I came back in the ring, or came back in the locker room, I sat down, and I had a somebody had given me a big 16-ounce beer, and I started to drink it, and Tony Atlas had drove with me, and he says, "Come on, Jim, let's get going," and I said, Tony, if you want to go, you can go with somebody else. I said, I'm going to sit and rest. I just did an hour, as you saw, and I'm going to enjoy this beer and I'm going to take a 5 or 10 minute shower and then we'll go. He said, okay. Yeah, but Rick was incredible. He was so far ahead of everybody. And, you know, he was I mean, he was made for pro wrestling, and to this day, I know he's had a lot of problems, financially, and he's made a fortune, and it's sort of it's heartbreaking to see a guy who's given so much to the wrestling profession that he did, over 50 years, and to have so much consternation and not to be a positive in terms of financially. I mean,
Mm.
I always say that Rick was probably one of the highest paid wrestlers. He probably made 15-20 million dollars, but he spent 25 million. So it's hard to come up with a plus after that.
That's an amazing quote. Yeah, I've never heard it be put that way before, but yeah, you're probably not far off with the figures as well. Um,
Yes.
and it's such a shame because, even when I was a kid, he used to call himself the man, but he was still the man, when I was watching then. And it's kind of a shame that people maybe who are getting into wrestling these days and kind of look back on the greatest wrestlers of every generation if they do history and stuff. But maybe they won't have the maybe they won't have the same kind of feelings that I had as a kid when I was watching him. Does that make sense?
Well, it does because times have changed so much in
Mm.
terms of what the product is for people to watch. Now you watch AEW and WWF or whatever it's called now, and it's there's so much activity in the ring, and there's so many false finishes, and there's so many, and nobody takes the time. The timing's not there.
Mm.
The timing's not there anymore. So and then, tag teams, these guys they're getting heat on one member of the tag team. And then this guy, instead of tagging out and, creating heat and have that partner come in and kick ass and make a big comeback, he makes his own comeback and tags out and the crowd goes, you know, and that's what's really missing, I think, in today's wrestling on TV is the timing. I mean, these guys are so concerned about getting what they can do in that it nothing means anything. I mean, it's just boom, 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 1, 2, 1 kick out, 1, 2, kick out, 1, 2, kick out, and boom, boom, boom. And you have all these powerful deals, and these guys are coming off the top rope and suplexing and then throwing guys on the table, and I just can't watch it anymore.
Mm. you mentioned about tag teams then, and we mentioned in the intro as well the tag team in the AWA with Greg, the High Flyers. What was it like when you were first put in the team with Greg there down in AWA?
Well, the great thing, like I said, Bench, about the AWA is the talent, is those guys knew their position and everybody had a doggone good match. I mean, the guys that work with us, and then, Brian and I had it tough in the WWE or WWF is because they thought, well, we don't want to sell too much because nobody sells that much in the WWE. If they do, they look like they're weak. But see, that's where the heels don't realize that that's where they get over. They're weak, they can't compete. So what do? They follow the baby face. They poke him in the eyes, they grab him by the throat, they pull his tights, and it's just, it's a reverse learning situation what we have now. I'm gonna cough.
That's okay. We saw in some of those clips there, the drop kick that you became famous for, really. And even to this day, when people list people that had some of the best drop kicks of all time, you hear of Kurt Hennig. More recent day, we have AJ Styles and Kazuchika Okada, who all have amazing drop kicks. And your name is still thrown in there as well. Why do you think that move kind of stood out to you, and how did you master it so well compared to say other wrestlers?
Well, Benj, I was a state high jump champion twice in high school,
That would
and
help.
I was a college letterman in high school, our college, and I used to do the dive straddle. I didn't do the Fosbury flop,
Mm,
but I had my best height was 6'7.5". So I had 37.5 inch vertical lift, which,
mm.
they always say white man can't jump, but I was the complete opposite of that. I mean, when I was in high school, I used to dunk every layout in warm up, and my coach used to say, "What are you doing that for?" And I said, "Because I can," you know. So, I was gifted with the ability to drop kick, and I remember Vern says, "I want to see how high you can drop kick." So he was standing in the ring, in the middle of the ring, and he says, "I'm going to put my hand up over my head, and I want you to see if you can hit the palm of my hand." I said,
Mm.
"Okay." So I was standing. I didn't take any steps or nothing, and I jumped up and I kicked his hand, and his hand was about 8 inches over his head. And he says, "Well," he says, "you're going to do well with your drop kick." So I did. I was fortunate, and I threw, I don't know how many drop kicks. Geez. Matter of fact, I have one here. It just came from, like I said, this WrestleCon, and
Mhm.
I don't know if you can see this, but here it is. This.
Mhm.
Okay, let me see.
Oh, is that from the
This is
big
from,
event? Maybe
yes,
it is.
Toronto.
It is. Ah, right. Okay, brilliant.
Yeah, but and they had, and this was on, we wrestled the Funk Brothers. It was Dory Funk and what's his name? I can't think of his name now, but he's a wrestler out of Canada too. But so this was in the Toronto Sun. So we wrestled on Saturday night, and the main event was Hulk against Paul Orndorff.
Mm.
They had 70,000 people outside. It was huge. And so I get up in the morning, I'm going to the airport, and I go, and there's the paper, the Toronto Sun paper, and this is on the front page of the paper, and it took me 6 weeks before I could find the guy, the photographer who took that, and he didn't want to give me a print. And I said, "For God's sake, I crossed my fingers and I said, I promise I won't sell it to anybody."
Yeah.
So I wound up having that, and I had cards made up for me, and I have a 5x7 that I sent. And actually, the two, and out of all the drop kicks that I've thrown, that has the best perception of the view of, instead of looking
Yeah.
straight up, which we can't get the perspective how high it is. This sort of looks down, and it's a great picture of a drop kick, and I'll never forget, I showed it to, I was backstage at Bruce Springsteen's one of his shows, and and I had signed this autograph for him, and he says, "Where are you?" And I says, "That's me." And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm drop kicking him." And he says, "Oh," he says, "Well," so I don't think he was too hip on pro wrestling, but he did know some people. But that is a great picture. And like I meant to say, I have two pictures that are two outstanding pictures of a drop kick, and the victim is both Dory Funk Jr.
All right, okay.
Yeah, and Dory's not doing too well. He's got a little bit of memory problem. So I saw him in St. Louis, I don't know, a couple months ago, and I went up and I signed both of these pictures for him. And I looked at it and I says, that's you, Dory. And he looked at me and he says, "Yeah, I thought so." So, he was a great guy. And what a talent those guys were.
Oh,
Both he
yeah.
and Terry Funk, God rest his soul,
Mm.
were, they were incredible guys in the early part of the business, I mean, in the late 60s or early 70s. And matter of fact, the one match that I saw, and I think it was a 45-minute time limit, and it was in St. Louis. It was Kiel Auditorium, and it was Nick Bockwinkel and Dory Funk, and they did like a 45-minute draw, and it was spectacular. I mean, nobody could follow. It was just incredible.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, there's so many lost matches like that, just to lost the time. Because there was just, it's so hard to find tape from like early 70s backwards, and this,
Yeah.
you get odd ones show up every so often, and it's just really grainy footage, and you can make out some things, but well, if you could go back and rewatch some of those matches,
Yeah,
unbelievable.
I have a couple that I refer to now on YouTube, and one was against Randy Savage,
Mhm.
and it was I think it was at Madison Square Garden, and I was leaving, so I did a job for Randy. But in the opening sequence, he snatched the headlock, and I threw him off and leapfrogged him, and then when he came off the rope, I hit him right smack in the mouth with a drop kick. And when I went to cover him, he was spitting blood out, and I said, "Oh God, here we go." But it was a great match, and there's another one on YouTube. It was an hour long. It was Nick Bockwinkel and I in Winnipeg Arena,
Mhm.
and it was a great match. And they show the whole doggone match. I think they were like a couple minutes shy. They said it was 60 minutes, and it was like 57 or 58. And I don't know if somebody punched something up or whatever, but yeah, those two, and now, it's very seldom when you go to a match, you ever see, people go over 25, 30 minutes. It's all bing, 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 10 to 12 or 15, maybe 20, 25. But my son-in-law and grandson just came back from that Money in the Bank match
Mhm.
in LA, and they said this one match, I can't remember what it was, but it might have been for they had ladders and everything else, and there was about 50 minutes, so that's pretty long. And I mean, they're choreographed to the point now where everything is just this, it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, all the way down to,
Mhm.
C.
Yeah.
So, it's just like I say, some people call me and, when fans talk to me and say, "Hey, what do you think of today's, product?" And I said, "Well," I said, excuse me, I said, "the best thing about today's product is the boys are making good money. I mean, a lot of the boys are making decent money." And I said, "That's the best thing." I said, they still don't have retirement. They still don't have, medical, you know, and because of that, and they have, they're still called independent contractors, so they have to pay their own taxes. So it was, it's a mess. And I remember, Jesse Ventura tried to get the union going, and I had talked to this Gene Upshaw, who was the head guy in the NFL, and he told me, and Jesse and I have arguments about this. Uh, he told me that in order for a union to work, that I needed Hulk Hogan. And Jesse was vehement. He says, "You don't need Hulk Hogan, Brunzell." He said, "You need, Bundy, because that's the guy he's working with." And I thought, well, I don't think so. I think you need the golden goose. So
Mhm.
it remains to be seen. But like I say, Benj, I'm glad that the guys are making the money and they're not wrestling, 30 days a month.
Mhm. When I think it was around 85 when you left the AWA, and it was
Yes,
funny we mentioned about guaranteed contracts then. There's a story, and I don't know if it's true. I wanted to ask you. You went to Vern and asked for a guaranteed contract at that time because you were also running a gym as well, and you wanted the
exactly.
guaranteed money to cover the gym and stuff, but he unfortunately didn't give you that, and then that's when you went to New York. Is that a true story?
Yes.
It
I
is.
asked him, I told him, I said, "Vern," I said, and this is what happened. They didn't want to give Hulk the belt
Mhm.
because it would have infringed too much on Vern's ego. Vern Gagne was a great athletic, collegiate type wrestler.
Mhm.
And Bockwinkel was the same way. He was so good in the ring as far as, I mean, he was a good heel, but I mean, he didn't heel everything. He out wrestled a lot of guys. So what he saw in Hulk Hogan was a big muscular, bass guitar player. And
Right.
he says, "Now how can I make him world champion, after the people have seen me?" And if he would have done that, the WWE never would be what it was today. So I told Vern, I said, "Vern," I said, "listen," I said, "things have gotten bad, Hulk, Vince has taken everybody, from different territories." And I said, I need $95,000 to stay. And he looked at me and he says, "You're not worth it." He says, "You can go to New York." So I left. So that was it, and I thought, I felt bad, but yeah, I went into New York with a positive attitude, and about a month later, they decided to put Brian together, he and I together, as the Killer Bees, and then
Yeah.
we borrowed some of uh, what's his name, Poffo, mm, let's see,
Lanny?
Lanny Poffos
Lanny Poffin.
black and yellow tights, and we wore
Oh,
those,
okay.
and then another fellow from Canada decided, that, he says, "You guys should wear masks because you look both the same size, and you could call yourself the Killer Bees, Brunzell and Blair." So that was a great identity, and a great, you know, deal, and at that time, if they would have done that, and then we wore the doggone, Nike Dunk
Yeah.
tennis shoes. And I got to tell you, Benj, I wrote Nike and I said, "Hey, we're a big national, wrestling deal." And I said, "We, are wearing these Nike Dunks." And you know what? They sent back a letter and they said, "Pro wrestling is below the standards of Nike, so we're not interested." So I thought, geez, and oh, if they and the people went crazy, when we do that, and the same with the mask, they could have merchandised the mask, and
Mhm.
we could have got a payoff from Diagon Nike, but Vince just, we weren't his cup of tea, and he didn't want us to, you know, do anything that he didn't really, was the fixer.
There's so many different things that, things like that, like, that just could have completely altered people's careers, the
Yes.
history of wrestling. If somebody at Nike had just been like, "Yeah, actually, we'll take everything could be completely different now." It's crazy how those little effects could have on the whole business at a time.
Well, at the same time, Benji, they could have sold those little black and yellow masks and made a
Yeah, of
fortune
course. Yeah.
because the kids said, "Where can we get them? Where can we get your masks?"
Hmm.
And I can't remember. They were made for us by Carl and Hildegard, and I think they were $150 that we paid a piece, and we had like four of them a piece, and we had a couple different styles, and it would have been nothing for the WWE to go to China and have them make 1,000 of them. They could have sold them for 10, $20 and made a fortune. But it wasn't in the writing. I mean, they were in the process of making lunch buckets and
Yeah.
umbrellas with Hulk Hogan and some other stuff that rightly so, but at the same time, they could have spread the wealth out a little bit better.
Mhm. Well, that's it. It could have been one of those, like Jim Duggan had the foam
Right.
plank of
The
wood,
two by fours.
and yeah, you could definitely see a kid in a mask holding one of those in his hand at the same
Yes.
time.
Yeah.
With the masks, it was quite a unique thing, I guess, looking back, because on paper, it's one of those things that seems like a real heel tactic,
Yep. And
to
that's
wear
why we
these
did it.
masks and things. But
Yeah.
because they were faces, somehow it still managed to work. I don't quite know how that managed to work.
Well, the fans were so used to
Mm.
having the heels do a dirty deed to
Yeah.
take advantage of the match or win. It was so out of line for a baby face to use the same sort of tactics against the heels. And thus we created, you know, the thought in the mind that gosh, the bees might, put those masks on and we also called it mass confusion. And, and then it's funny because there was sometimes Brian and I were in and out of there so many, we didn't even know who was supposed to be in there or not. you know, but it worked out good. And I'll tell you one time we had a 8-man tag and it was on TV and it was towards the end of our run.
Mm.
And at the end of the match, Coco Beware and George the Animal Steel and Brian and I all had the masks on at the end of the match. And and Coco was dancing like this, and George the Animal Steel was gnawing at the doggone turnbuckle. And I looked at Brian and I says, Brian, I says, you might as well bury us here, I think, because the Killer Bees will be done after this, because they ruined the whole gimmick.
Mm.
So, but that's Vince, that's his, handicap. He makes he can defeat you anytime he wants.
Like you and Brian, I can see why people with the masks on could kind of get confused over who was who. If it was you guys, Coco and George Animal Steel, I don't think that quite
No.
works the same. No.
And George the Animal Steel, had it twisted. So the eye hole was by his nose. So, and it was comical. I mean, it was funnier than hell. And then he went and he started biting, gnawing at the turnbuckle, which created a lot of laughter. And, it
Yeah.
sort of put the whole thing, it sort of wasted all the heat we built up, with the heels. And it was hilarious because I looked and I thought, God, it was funny, but it was at our cost.
Yeah, of course. Um, like that period of time is now known as the golden era, and it isn't just a moniker because it was the golden era of tag teams as well. We
Yes,
had the Hart Foundation, the
yes.
Bulldogs, obviously the Killer Bees. We had
Rick
uh
Martel and
Rick Martel and
yes,
oh god, got it in my head. Martel and Santana, sorry.
yes,
Strike Force, Demolition, all these different teams.
yes.
What were some of your favorite opponents to wrestle at that time?
Well, the Hearts, we had tremendous matches with the Hearts. We had tremendous matches with the Rougeos,
Mm.
and we had a half an hour draw with the British Bulldogs in Montreal that was just spectacular. I mean, we tore the house down. And there was such, like you say, there was such a talent, base of tag teams there, and Vince really didn't know what to do. I mean, he he was worried about one thing, and that was making sure that wherever Hulk Hogan went, that they sold out. And then, I mean, here's the deal with the WWE when I was there from 85 until 93 or whatever, it was off and on, fired me 3 times, hired me back twice. So, um, there was 60 guys and there was 3 towns running a night. So there was 20 guys in each town. So that's the way they worked their booking. And then George Scott, who, God rest his soul, was a nice guy, but to me, I thought he was the worst booker I've ever, his
Mm,
finishes were just, I'll tell you one thing, we were in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was Mid-Atlantic, and I had just lost the match, the Mid-Atlantic heavyweight champion to Khosrow Vaziri, the Iron Sheik.
mm,
So Khosrow had loaded his boot in the match and kicked me in the jaw, and down I went, and he beat me 1, 2, 3. So about a week later, I was wrestling on TV again against the Sheik, and I wound up putting the sleeper on the Sheik, and he was out. So I took his boot off. So I got his boot in my hand, and I ran over to the announcer, and I said, "Listen," I says, "the next time I run into, the Iron Sheik, I'm going to get my belt back, the Mid-Atlantic Championship, and I'm going to use his boot against him." So we're wrestling about 10 days later in, oh, geez, where was it? It was in Virginia. And it was a capacity crowd, really a good turnout. And Sandy Scott was George Scott's brother, and he was the agent in charge there. So, and of course, Cosmo and I were the main event. And so I got into the locker room, and Sandy Scott said to me, "Jim," he said, "did you get the finish from George?"
mm.
And I said, "No." I said, "What's the finish?" And he says, "Well, George wants you and Cosro to go 60-minute draw." And I looked at him and I said, "What?" I said, 60-minute draw. I says, "You might as well bury me in the middle of the ring because I'll never draw another dime." But that's how stupid he was. I mean, you know, here the baby faces got the gimmick, and he still can't beat the heel. So the logic is just
Yeah.
beyond me, and then a couple weeks later, Cosro and I were doing a spot show at a Indian reservation in South Carolina,
Mm,
and George Scott wanted us to do another hour draw.
right.
So in the course of the match, it was about 40 minutes. Cosmo went outside and he did something and he pulled me out. So we're fighting back and forth. And then Cosmo hurt his back. So he went down on his knee and he says, "I hurt my back. I hurt my back." And I said, "Well, just stay here and we'll get counted out."
Mm.
So we both got counted out, and the time was almost 50 minutes. The next day I get a call, Benj, and it's the North Carolina office. And they said, "George Scott wants to talk to you." So I came in the office, it's about 10 miles from my house, went in, and George Scott said to me, "Jimmy," he says, "you were supposed to do an hour last night in that Indian reservation." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Cosro hurt his back, and
Mm.
we just decided to take a count." And he says, "Well, Cosro was just in here, and he said it was your idea, and his back wasn't hurt at all."
Oh,
So, and then George fired me that day, and I was relieved because I had enough in North Carolina.
mm.
So to this day, and God rest his soul, Cosro, I when I confronted him with it, I says, "Cosro, what were you thinking of?"
Mm.
I said, "You said you hurt your back." And you know what he said to me? And this was his mentality. And he says, "Well, Jim," he says, "it was better that you get the heat than I get the heat." And that was his mentality.
Yeah.
That's just like when you know, Vince was drug testing everybody, for cocaine and steroids and
Mm.
whatever it was. So he came up to Cosro, I think it was at Madison Square Garden or something, and he came up to Cos and he says, "Sheiky, you tested positive." And she says, "Oh, great." He says, "That's good, positive, isn't it?" And Vince says, "No." He said, "You flunked."
I think there was a lot of times when Sheik would have possibly tested positive for
Oh,
one
he
thing
was.
or another. Yeah. um, yeah. What a character. I don't know if we get characters like that anymore. You know,
No.
I just don't think we do. Just these such unique characters. like ECW always used to get the moniker of the land of the misfit toys. And wrestling as a whole used to be that. You used to get people of all different ages, different sizes, different backgrounds. Whereas now it all seems a bit more homogenized, you know?
Well,
It's,
Benj, the deal is it takes time to develop a character. You've got to spend time with it. And
mm,
these people now that are having these matches on, whether it be the TV matches, it's bing, 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 high spot, a little bit of heat, bing, 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 either out the door they go or somebody else runs in, and there's no time to develop that a persona that a heel really needs or a baby face really needs to get over with the crowd. That's as simple as that.
and I guess what when we mentioned earlier about things not being recorded in those early days, now everything is recorded. People
Yes.
have their very first match, and that's out there. It's blown up over Twitter and everything. And
Yep.
sometimes it could be before they've even kind of developed the character that they want to be, and maybe they're not quite as seasoned as they should be on those first few shows. So it is kind of that double-edged sword, I guess, in a way.
It is. It is. I mean, uh, today's pro wrestling they are their own worst enemy. What they're trying to do, and they want to outdo. I mean, the AEW wants to outdo the WWE, and the WWE wants to outdo the AEW, and you can't tell them apart when you watch. Unless you see their logo up above. I mean, you see and now the guys are jumping back and forth from the different
Mm.
territories, and you can't keep them straight.
Mm.
Although I do think the two best wrestlers that I see, I mean,
Mm,
and I don't watch AEW very much, but Barry Orton to me is by far the best,
mm,
and then Jeff Owens. Those two guys, I think, are the top of whether it be the WWE or WWF.
mm.
Um, AW or AEW, I like Don Callis as a good heel manager. He's done a great job, and he's a friend of mine. And he was very ahead of everybody. And other than that, I just don't have too much interest.
You showed that amazing photo from the big event earlier. Another massive show that you were on, the 93,000 people in the Silver Dome for WrestleMania 3. What's
Yep.
it like? Because obviously when you joined WWF at the time, it was just after WrestleMania 1. So you'd seen what they could do. WrestleMania 2, they kind of split into three different cities,
Yep.
still kind of finding their feet. What was it like kind of getting to 87 then when they had this absolutely massive show in the Sky Dome for WrestleMania 3? What was it like kind of going from, decent crowds, obviously, but then to this huge, gigantic show?
Well, as I remember, everybody, it was really built up. Vince did a good job of building
Mhm.
the heat level between Andre and Hulk and everything. And then, Brian and I, they had us and they had us going right before them. And we were against Volkov. And
Yep.
and here's another, I want to mention this. Here's a really lousy finish by George Scott. So, and they were trying to, get Jimmy Duggan and Hacksaw Duggan over. And so during our course of our match, they got some heat on us. We made, some comebacks against Nikolai and Khosrow, and then they fouled us, cheated us, and then Duggan comes in with his 2x4 and gets us disqualified, for interfering in the match.
Yeah.
And we are supposed to pat Jim Duggan on the back and thank him. And this was George Scott's
Mm.
idea. And oh God, that was about the closest I ever came to nailing George Scott, because that was the stupidest finish I've ever seen. I mean, it was, and from that point on, all we did was go downhill. And, they're booking, you know, uh, and they're booking Jim, Jim Duggan against Cosroe, and I don't know if you heard the little deal what happened to them in Asbury Park, and they got stopped by the cops, and
Yeah.
oh, but you can't argue with success.
But things like that, like in kayfabe, like you said, like you would notice that because okay, the fans they saw Jim Duggan coming in, but in kayfabe, surely the winner of the match would have maybe got more money and prestige. If somebody comes and interferes, they've cost them that match, so they're going to cost them
Exactly.
money, you know. And yeah, it's strange sometimes that yeah, they just it doesn't matter about that. We just need Jim Duggan in there. We'll throw that in, and it's
Exactly.
just yeah,
They could
very
have
strange.
had they could have just thrown the match up and said no contest. He
Hmm.
came in, but then then they gave it to ay 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 ay.
Yeah.
Honest to God, and oh, and to this day, Brian and I still, they had told us that we were going to get the belts from the
Mm.
Hearts, and we beat them on TV in Buffalo, and it was a hell of a match. And they said, "Oh, you couldn't because you guys switched or something." They had some outside acknowledgement that we had switched guys and when the legal guy wasn't in there at the finish and just stuff like that that was so picky and so petty that it was their way to have a logical conclusion to
Yeah.
pro wrestling. So we just, I just sort of bid my time and I was happy um when I finally just broke the ties because I was completely worn out and my body was aching. And since that, Benji, I've had 14 surgeries. I've
Mhm.
had 6 on my knees, 3 on my shoulders, both shoulders replaced, both knees replaced. My right knee's been replaced 3 times, and my hip replaced. And then I had a blood clot in my testicle, believe it or not.
Mm.
That had to be removed. And then I had a pinched nerve in my elbow that I needed surgery on. So, and another fact that people don't realize, you have no medical, you had to pay for
Yeah.
all that yourself, and that was thousand. Thank God, we had Medicare here.
Mhm.
And, during the time I was close to being 65 and, it helped, but, today, and I remember Cosmo, this is another, we're in Richmond, Virginia, and Cosmo used to get real excited in a match, and especially if the heat was there and he's making,
Yeah.
I'm making a comeback on him, boom, 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 boom. And then finally he kicked me in the neck with the boot again. So he puts this camel clutch on me or something, whatever the hell it was. And then he wound into some sort of a sleeper, and I'm almost completely out, and I'm I'm trying to give him the office, squeezing his arms, saying, let go." And then he grabs me by the hair, and I stumble twice. He throws me out onto the ring, out onto the
Mm.
floor, and I hit my eye right here,
Mm.
and it butterflied open. It cut open in 2 spots. I had 29 stitches,
Oh.
$675. And he says, "Jim, what happened to your eye?" I says, "Kazo, if you don't know what happened to my eye, there's no use me explaining." He was a dangerous guy in the ring, but it all worked out. So
With those injuries, like long, well, not even say injuries, but the wear and tear. You've said the knee operations, the hip operations. Um, how much is it still affecting you now? In your day to day things. Could you, with the operations all successful? Do you find it easier moving around now?
no, I'm having a very tough time. I
Mm,
have
okay.
what they call neuropathy, which is
Right.
it's nerve damage from my knees down to my toes.
Mm,
And I have screws holding in these new shoulders.
hmm.
Same with the hip. And in the morning, when I get up, I have to steady myself for about 20 seconds when I get out of bed. Otherwise, I'll fall down.
Mm,
So, and I can't lift, I can only lift 20 pounds in each hand. That's it. And I can't do any leg work. And if I'm on a long time or if I'm walking, like we went to Europe a year ago,
mhm,
and we had 3 weeks in Europe and we had 16 stops. And at the end of the day, when I'd come back, I couldn't walk. I had to ice my
mm,
knees take a hot tub because it just I have in my left knee, especially what they call tendinosis, which is a, a long time effect of the tendon in your patella,
Mm.
and it's just inflamed all the time. And I had they take blood out of your arm and they centrifuge it and then they stick it back into your knee,
Right.
and that was like $2,000 in each knee, and it didn't work.
Mm.
So now, and they probably have this in Wales, and they don't have it in the United States. They have what they call, it's called N stride, N
Mm.
as in Nancy, stride, STRIDE, and it's a sort of an additive to the PRP shot that they mix your blood with, and then they mix it with something else. And instead of having a time period of 6 months or 8 months, of relatively calmness and no pain,
Mm.
it works for 2 to 3 years in the joint.
Right. Okay.
So the only problem is the United States and our medical association won't okay it because it would kill the cortisone injection, because why would you want to get a cortisone, for 8 weeks or 6 months, when you can have the same thing in the last 2 to 3 years?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about going back to Canada and trying to get it
Mhm.
done. I called Rochester Mayo Clinic, and they don't, it still hasn't passed.
Right. They're things that we just don't think about as fans, enough. The wear and tear on people. Um, I need to bring up when you left WWF. Obviously, you're known for the WWF and obviously AWA, but you competed in a lot of tours of Japan as well with
Yes,
All Japan,
yes,
which was it was almost like the Premier League during that time in Japanese wrestling. What are
yes.
some of your fondest memories when you went to Japan?
Well, you worked hard, and it was funny because you're familiar with Haku,
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
Tonga Haku. Um, the very first time I was over there, he was 17 years old, and he's working for the Baba in All Japan. And I remember he was like 6'3" and 225 pounds, and hell of a talent. And I remember during our match, and we didn't talk to the Japanese that much. We just sort of realized what the finish was, and boom, went
Mm.
from there. So we had this match, and all of a sudden he throws me in, and he hits me right in the forehead with the drop kick. And I swear to God, I thought I was in LA instead of Tokyo. So I got up, and he goes to cover me, and I said, "Hey, I'm supposed to give those, not take those." And I told him that the other night when I was in it. He laughed like a son of a gun. But yeah, it was. I worked hard, and I remember
Mm.
Jumbo Sharuda
Mhm.
was the champion there, and he and I had a either 45-minute or hour draw, and it was a hell of a match. And I love, I mean, those guys work hard and tough,
Mhm.
and they don't do that much healing. It's just being rough, you know.
Right.
So and Baba and I got along very well. I remember Baba, I worked with him, and one of the first times I was over there, and his finish, he'd throw you in, and he'd put that big foot up, and he'd hit you right here and lift you off the ground, boom, and he beat you. So I come flying off the ropes, and he was sort of um he wasn't very physically adept at balance, because he was
Right.
6'10" or whatever it was. So he goes to throw the boot up, and I come flying, hit the boot, and I threw my legs up in the air, and I came in like I was landing, and I came in like my legs were spread, and I hit him right by the shin, and, and it anchored him, and all of a sudden his arms started going like this, and he fell over backwards, and that was supposed to be the finish. And I thought, oh, and he went, whoa. But it was so hilarious, I thought, oh God. And he said, Jim, you come too fast off the rope. I said, I'm sorry.
we mentioned at the very beginning that you faced a really young Ric Flair in the AWA. Well, when you
Yep.
were in Japan, you also faced another legend and a very young Kenta Kobashi, who just had this legendary career in Japan. What was it like wrestling him? And could you see anything in him at the time? You know that he was going to become this legendary figure.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, you can tell. You can sense when you're in the ring with somebody that's got,
Yeah.
that is a young, talented guy, and then you can just notice that he's going to get better.
Mhm.
And they had like Anuki on the other side. On the New Japan, I remember watching a match him and Hulk Hogan had. I was over there the same time, and can't remember what year it was, but I think I was over there six times in Japan,
Mhm.
and Terry was over there, and I swear to God, Terry Bollea and what's Anuki had one of the greatest matches I ever saw, and Hulk, 6'7", 6'8", 300 pounds, and then he's down there on his hands and knees and turning, and
Mm.
it was great. And I told Terry, I says, "Holy Christ!" I says, "Being in Japan, it's a lot different than going like this." In Madison Square Garden, you're putting up your ear
Yeah.
and say, "Oh yeah," you know.
Uh,
So be
quick,
it.
quickly before we let you go
Okay.
tonight, um, over the years, you've had some amazing wrestling figures. You had the LJN figure. I think that was in the late 80s. Then
Yep.
Jax came along with their
Yep.
classic superstars. I think that was 2009. And recently, you teamed up with Epic Toys, and they've
Yes.
got these classic Hasbro style figures, which
Oh,
are
they're great.
now sold out. You know,
Yes, they
they're that
have.
good. Um,
Yeah.
what's it like for you that even in like 2025 now that we're in, people are still making wrestling figures of you and obviously Brian, and they're still selling out. They're still hard to get.
Well, it's great because and that's not so much for me, but I'm talking about my kids and my grandkids, and then, it's funny, like I went to a class reunion, it was a
Mm.
50th class reunion, and then
Eh,
somebody brought this Digon, I can't remember if it was WWE or AWA ones, but and they wanted me to sign it, and I thought, well, okay, so and I use them now as a fundraiser. I have a very
mm,
close friend, and she works for a company called H2O for Life, and I sort of call her the Mother Teresa of White Bear Lake,
mm,
Minnesota. Her name's Patty Hall, and what she has done is she has made the world know of what uh, lack of portable and drinkable water is in Africa.
mm,
And the kids and some of them, they walk 5, 6 miles a day to get this fresh water. So she's been doing this for, I don't know, 20 some years and done a great job. And, if I can, give up sell it, have them go for, some donation, and then they raise some money, good, more power to them. So, it's sort of nice, you see these, and then the some of the guys I played, football with in college, and they said,
mm.
Is it true you've got dolls made of you?" And I
Yeah.
said, "No, they're action figures."
Yeah. There's a very distinctive difference, very
That's
distinctive.
right.
Jim, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Genuinely, I don't say it to everybody. It's been one of my favorites, and it's such an honor to have you on the show. I'm so glad we managed to get our schedules to
Me
match
too.
up. But yeah, I had a great time today.
Oh,
Is there
me too.
anything that you want to promote that you've got coming up in the next few months? Anything like that?
Well, this book,
Matt
Matland,
Vance, of course.
is, let me see when I can get it. Yeah. I better do it this way.
There you go.
I wrote, and it's 10 years old. It's all true. And it more or less has my life story in it. And it's available on Blurb, BLURB. And I think it's $25. And Benji, if you send me your address, I'll send you a copy of this.
Oh, that'll be
It's
amazing.
real nice. And it's fun, and I've got a chapter about Bruce Springsteen in there and how good he's been with my family, and
Mm.
um, Mary and I are going to celebrate, like I said, our 50th anniversary coming up next month, and we were in Winnipeg just let's see, it was the 13th of, yeah, I don't know what, in November, I think it was, or something like that. And that was the 50th time we've seen Bruce.
Oh, wow.
50. So, he's the greatest, and I feel very, very fortunate. Not everybody can say they've met their hero, and I've
No.
been very fortunate. So,
Oh,
plus he
wow.
doesn't like Trump either.
There we go. That's the main thing. Amazing albums, and he doesn't like Trump. Yeah, good for us. Thank you so much, Jim. Stay on the line, and we'll do a proper goodbye off camera as well as we
Okay.
wrap this show up here today, guys.
Okay.
Another amazing interview on this channel today. You could see, I think, how much I've smiled all the way through this interview. Um, Jim was one of those people that I absolutely love when I was watching those old Silvervision Coliseum videos. WrestleMania 2, 3, and 4, it was just a massive part of my childhood. It was an absolute honor to have him on the channel today. I'm also going to get the link from Jim as well. For the Matlands book on Blurb we heard about. So we're going to put that down in the description as well. So you could definitely get your copies then. But please leave a like and subscribe on the channel, guys. Leave a comment down with your favorite Jim Brunzell matches and memories, and we'll chat about those in the comments. But as always, guys, look after each other. Peace, and we'll see you guys soon. Bye, guys.